Hi, my name is Eric Dewar. I'm Associate Professor of Biology at Suffolk University, and there I teach a class about evolution for students who don't major in science called Humans and the Evolutionary Perspective. And I'm here with two of my honor students today, and we're going to talk about an article that we read from a few years ago called The Development of Antimicrobial Agents in the Era of New and Emerging Infectious Diseases and Increasing Antibiotic Resistance. So it's a review article that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association that from kind of a while ago, from 2001, that was talking about, what happens, what do we understand about why we've seen this recent rise in antibiotic resistant bacteria, and what are some things that we could try to do to combat this before our antibiotics basically become unusable altogether. But before we get too much into this, why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm a freshman at Suffolk and I major in political science and I'm from Connecticut.
Hi, I'm Megan. I am a sophomore at Suffolk. I study English and I'm also from Connecticut.
All right. So were you two, in preparing for this, I looked up some more recent stuff, thinking about, and particularly about surveys that have been done for the public about their awareness of antibiotic resistance. Was this something that you guys were aware of from being around?
A little bit. Like I knew some stuff about antibiotic resistance and how it's becoming more of a problem just because of how diseases and stuff have evolved, but I don't know too much about it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've definitely heard stuff like about the flu, how the vaccine sort of is either like more effective or less effective, like depending on the year. But other than that, no.
Yeah, that's actually a little bit different because when we're talking about antibiotics, we're talking about things that kill living cells, right? So always talking about bacteria. So antibiotic resistance isn't related to diseases that are caused by viruses. So I think that's the one thing to, what you're saying is right, Gabby, is that the seasonal flu evolves every year. So that means that it like looks a little bit different on the surface to the immune cells of our body that are going to defend against it, but that's not the exact same problem as antibiotic resistance we're talking about here. This is, you have there's a cut on your foot that gets invaded by bacteria and fungi, and then you need to have antibiotics or antifungals to be able to clear it up. Or people who go to the hospital, they get what are called nosocomial infections that happen when they're in hospital. So those are like Staphylococcus aureus is a really common infection that people get in the hospital. They go to the hospital for a knee replacement, but they get a staph infection just because that's like the kinds of bugs that live there because sick people are in the hospital. So yeah, where do you want to start with this? I mean, they talk a little bit about how, like, what did you understand about how antibiotic resistance kind of develops in the first place?
Well, I didn't realize how many like infectious disease like deaths happen like worldwide. Like I didn't actually know that was one of the like leading deaths. But I thought it was interesting how they talked about like changes in human behavior could possibly like make us like more likely or like less likely to pick up more diseases. Like they talked about like the food industry as being like a big one, um, which obviously like kind of relates to um, the coronavirus or the
Yeah,
COVID.
yeah, a little bit. I mean, how do you like? What do you know? What do you understand about how the food industry is related to this?
Well, if like food isn't being handled like properly or with meat, if it's like not stored properly and it isn't like stored at like the proper temperature.
Hmm. Part of it's that, and part of it is the food storage and kind of cross contamination that can happen. But it actually goes farther than that too, because you figure, I don't know if you've ever seen a factory farm before. Our family goes out to Minnesota in the summertime where my father-in-law is, and they have turkey farms out there, and they'll have these really big enclosures, covered enclosures where the turkeys live, and they're like cheek by jowl with the one next to them. So it's really easy for infections to pass from bird to bird. So they're oftentimes, at least in the past, particularly in the 90s when this was starting to grow up, they will get, they'll be given kind of low doses of antibiotics to try to keep, keep these kinds of things at bay. So it's not just in foodborne illness, though that's a problem. It's a problem with basically these antibiotics that then are basically given to these animals in kind of really low levels, and like low levels of antibiotic is really great at developing resistance. Because if you like totally nuke a bug with a population of bugs with antibiotics, that'll kill most of them, and then your immune cells can do the rest. But here you give them like kind of low levels, it kills some of them, but not enough, and then the ones that survive are the ones that are going to propagate, and your immune cells can't handle those. And also, those antibiotics end up in the wastewater too. So when they go out in the water, then it goes into then everybody, and this we find this everywhere around the world. Even I saw a paper one time that was even in the outback of Australia, you can find antibiotics and metabolism, like breakdown products of antibiotics, like in the water, like in the wild. So we're seeing this sort of wash of antibiotics, not just focally on people, but also on animals in the food stream, as well as just like out in the environment because of the way we have them been used.
Is that also why like a lot of brands will advertise like, oh, antibiotics aren't used because of the effect that it has on the environment and like the water systems?
Yes. Yeah. So this is sort of like the response about, you buy your water bottles that are metal, or they say they're BPA free now or something, because we know now that when plastic gets heated up, it breaks down into these products that actually mimic hormones, particularly like reproductive hormones like estrogens. So we're trying to combat that by using a different, not by using metal, although the metal has to get coated with plastic, but it's a different kind of plastic, one that doesn't break down in high heat this as well. But yeah, so it's a problem, but now it's advertised, no hormones, no antibiotics on the foods that we buy, because people have the sense, it's like buying organic. I think people have the sense that like this is somehow healthier, but it's and that's saying they're not wrong exactly, but that's a little hard to parse, just because in some ways they're just trying to sell food. Yeah, Megan, what do you think was interesting in this article?
Well, there were, I have a bunch of like different parts that I found were interesting.
Mm.
Um, I mean, especially with like the drug options for treatments and stuff, because I know it was talking about how they're getting harder to find that they work, or they just don't have any for certain things because of how different diseases are evolving, which I thought was, I mean, it's interesting, but it's also slightly concerning, of course, with what's happening, especially now and all that. But then, was it? There was also another section that just how how the natural antibiotics work as well.
Mm.
Like, because it said evolution allowed the selection of targets that could be inhibited efficiently in competitive microorganisms, but not so efficiently that the antibiotic producing organism could not devise an intrinsic resistance mechanism against its own drug product. I thought it was just kind of interesting how they work, but they can also work against each other. So then they're not as effective. But just kind of in general, how a lot of things aren't as effective as they could be because they evolved to be not so effective, if that made any sense whatsoever.
No, I get you, because what this is all right. A couple things just to make sure we're on the same page. We talk about broad spectrum antibiotics and narrow spectrum antibiotics. Broad spectrum antibiotics are things like penicillin, or even all the way up to like vancomycin, ones that that basically kill lots of different kinds of cells. Now the thing is, the stronger the antibiotic, the meaner it is on your body, because it's also made out of cells. So we want to try to you want to use something it's hard to use something so broad spectrum on a body. On the other hand, these bacteria, because they live in communities in the soil, communities in your gut, they have evolved their own little like narrow spectrum, like chemical warfare, to be able to kill off other individuals from their species or from related species that are that are going to be that they're trying to compete with for space or resources. So now becomes an arms race where one strain makes an antibiotic that kills another strain. So that the strain that's will try to develop a countermeasure against it. So this one has to find like a countermeasure. So it ends up kind of escalating in this arms race. So in some ways, what you're saying is right, where if there's a particular disease that's always caused by a given strain of bacterium, and you have like this naturally co-evolved chemical defense against it, that's actually a super effective way to be able to kill that off. And because it's evolved to kill the bacteria, a particular bacterium, it's not going to have an effect on on human cells. So that would be sort of where the goal is. But even at that, um, even at that level, it's hard to, because we're looking at the result, things that are like the result of history of arms races. We end up, it's really hard to be able to find these specific ones and find something that's going to be effective enough.
And so, because I know penicillin is one of like the main things, how does, because of course people have allergies to penicillin, how does that kind of affect the whole situation?
Having allergies to penicillin, that's allergies develop because our immune cells um, release. Whenever we get infected with anything, even something as simple as like a mosquito bite, most people are, you get itchy from a mosquito bite because most people are allergic to the stuff that's in the saliva of the mosquito. But the reason why it forms like a little raised area that's itchy and might be a little warm, it's because the first one of the first lines of chemical defenses we have is this thing called the inflammation reaction. And when cells, because there are cells that are built when they come in contact with a particular foreign substance, they have receptors on their surface that then will turn on that cell to cause it to release things that are going to cause an immune reaction. So now, the reason why this is relevant is when, if something like penicillin, there's something in the penicillin that some people are sensitive to, and so they respond like it's something to be allergic to. In fact, I mean, we're recording this on April 8th, 2020, so we're all at home because of the coronavirus pandemic here. But one of the things that's a consequence, one of the reasons, the thing that kills people with coronavirus is what's called a cytokine storm, which is, again, some of these inflammatory mediators that get released. And so it really starts, and like when blood vessels start getting leaky, then they leak fluid out into some other spaces. So particularly the reason why the cough or breathing problems are associated with it is because when those capillaries around the lungs get so leaky, it causes the lungs to get all filled up with fluid, and then it makes it more difficult to breathe, and also gets it more difficult to be able to exchange gases, which of course is the job of the lungs. So it's related in that regard, in that sometimes these substances that we use to try to kill the bugs, there's something about their structure, chemical structure, that we're also sensitive to.
Um, I mean, I know another thing, at least for me, was that kind of last part that did talk about the ideas for the future
Hmm.
and how, I mean, how much they were warning of what could happen. And this, since it's 2001, they're fairly correct.
Yeah.
That we need to really be careful and take those precautions, which were perhaps not always taken considering our current situation.
Yeah, one thing that I thought, I did a quick search of some articles that were more recent than 20 years ago. And, this we see relatively level, like, well, we don't see increasing levels of kind of low dose antibiotics going out in a lot of developed nations, like in the food production streams. But when you look in developing nations, that's actually increasing a lot, which is selecting for these antibiotic resistant bugs. Some other stuff I saw, I had to write this down. Um, we're now more aware of the effects of like climate change and antibiotic resistance, not just because when not just because it gets warmer, although some bacteria work better when it's warmer, but it's because as the climate changes, that can also change the biodiversity of the soil. And when the microbiome of the soil changes, that ends up, and that makes it like or even agriculture does this too. When you go from like having a wild soil to one that has a particular constituency because of the way the soil's been, nutrients been taken out of the soil, we're seeing different kinds of bugs evolve there. A lot of the things that were brought up in this paper have more or less come to pass in that, but I think the way that we're approaching this, from either a climatic or an economic point of view, that's something that's like a little bit different in the complexion of what these studies are. And it's just going to get more, and because that's what people are more aware of now. And even thinking about economic differences, we were aware of, economic inequality 20 years ago. But I think because it's even gotten that much more exacerbated, particularly if you think about like the bottom billion or the bottom 2 billion of humans, I think these kinds of problems are becoming significant in ways that like we hadn't really thought to look at them before. Gabby, what else do you want to throw on this before we close?
Well, I really liked like what Megan was talking about, but I also thought it was interesting the is it the xenobiotics? I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Hmm.
I didn't know much about xenobiotics at all, but I thought that that was interesting how you can use non like natural like compounds basically to like try and make these antibiotics more effective, but then how like there's also like a potential downside to them if you use like too much.
Yeah, the idea is you got to use them in concert with something else, right? So these xenobiotics are great because, all right, naturally evolved narrow spectrum antibiotics are super because we know they're effective. On the other hand, there are countermeasures that are in place because they've evolved with it. But these xenobiotics, they should allow you to be able to, it's basically something that's never been seen before, incapacitate the bug in one way, and then you attack one of these like essential proteins, which is something on the surface, so that you can give it kind of a 1-2 punch. I think that's sort of like the rationale for how it works. Because if it's something that's novel, it means that there aren't countermeasures that have evolved against it. So that might be a fruitful way to be able to attack this. And it's something that you couldn't have done 20 years ago, because like, and as computer computational power goes up, then I think it's also going to make it more likely that we're going to be able to develop these kinds of things to be able to kill, antibiotics to kill off these bugs. Well, I'm afraid our time is short today, but anyway, tell everybody thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.